Section 15, Book 4, Chapter 1, Part 2 of The History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 2, by Henry Charles LEA. Book 4, Organization, Chapter 1, Part 2. The Inquisitor-General and Supreme Council. Carlos was industriously stripped and anointed and purged and prayed over, but to no purpose save to terrify and exhaust him. For a year correspondence was vigorously kept up, obtaining from the demons answers curiously explicit and yet evasive and contradictory. At one time it was said that he had been bewitched on a second occasion, September 24, 1694. Then the demons refused to say more, except that their previous assertions had been false and that Carlos had not been bewitched. There were also contradictions as to the sorceresses employed, who were named and their addresses were given, but the efforts to find them were fruitless. The destinies of Spain were made to hang on the flippant utterances of hysterical girls, who unsaid one day what they had averred the day before. The affair reached such proportions that the Emperor Leopold officially communicated the revelations of a Viennese demoniac, implicating a sorceress named Isabel, who was searched for in vain, and he also sent to Madrid a celebrated exorcist named Fray Moro Tenda, who secretly exorcised the king for some months, which naturally aggravated his malady. Meanwhile, a storm was brewing. The Queen's temper had been aroused by her political defeat. She was angered by the enforced separation from her husband, and she was inflamed to fury when she secretly heard of the second bewitching of September 1694, which was attributed to her. A month after her learning this, Rocaberti died, with suspicious opportuneness, June 19, 1699. This failed to relieve her, for soon afterwards 3 endemoniadas in Madrid were found confirming the story and implicating both her and the former Queen Regent. Her wrath was boundless, and she vowed Fray Froilan's destruction, for which the Inquisition offered the readiest means. To this end she sought to induce Carlos to appoint in Rocaberti's place Fray Antonio Foix de Cardona, a friend of Don Juan Tomas, Admiral of Castile, who had fallen from power when Mattia was dismissed. The king, however, who was resolved on pushing the investigation, appointed Cardinal Alonso de Aguilar, and sent for the papal commission. In announcing his choice to Aguilar, he said it was for the purpose of probing the matter to the bottom. To this Aguilar pledged himself, and promptly sent for the senior member of the Suprema, Lorenzo Foix de Cardona, a half-brother of Antonio, telling him that all indications pointed to the guilt of the admiral, who must at once be arrested and his papers seized. Cardona replied that this was impossible. Semi-proof was requisite prior to arrest, and here there was no evidence. The Queen grew more anxious than ever. Aguilar was taken with a slight indisposition, he was bled secundum artem, and in 3 days he was dead, on the very day that his commission arrived from Rome. Suspicion was rife, but there was no proof. Carlos, by this time, was so enfeebled that the Queen obtained from him the appointment of Balthazar de Mendoza, Bishop of Segovia, with whom she had a satisfactory understanding, he pledging himself to gratify her vindictiveness, and she promising him a cardinal's hat as the reward of success. The first move was against the Austrian exorciser Fray Tenda, who was arrested in January 1700 on a different charge, but under examination he described the revelations of the Madrid demoniacs, made in Froilan's presence, and he escaped with abjuration de levi and banishment. Froilan was then examined, but he refused to speak without the consent of the king, under whose orders he had acted and with strict injunctions of secrecy. Meanwhile the Dominican provincial, Torres Padmoda, used his authority to obtain from Arguelles at Cangas the letters of Froilan, on the strength of which he promptly accused him to the Suprema in the name of the order, to which Froilan answered that he had acted under Rocaberti's order at the pressing instance of the king, in what was sanctioned by Aquinas and other doctors. Mendoza informed the king that Froilan was accused of a grave offence, but could not be prosecuted without the royal permission. Charles resisted feebly and then yielded to the pressure of the queen, and Mendoza, by dismissing him and replacing him with Torres Padmota. Stunned, dazed, and helpless, Froilan obeyed Mendoza's order to betake himself to the Dominican convent at Valladolid, but on the road he turned his steps and sought refuge in Rome. A royal letter to the Duke of Uceda, then ambassador, was speedily obtained ordering the arrest of Froilan on his arrival, as he was under trial by the Inquisition, which permitted no appeal to Rome, while the tribunals of Barcelona and Murcia were instructed to throw him, on arrival, into the secret prison. He was shipped back to Cartagena and duly immured by the Murcia tribunal. Then followed a struggle for mastery in the Suprema. Mendoza procured the assent of the members to the appointment of special calificadores, or censors, to consider the charges and evidence. 5 theologians were selected who reported unanimously, June 23, 1700, that there was no matter of faith involved, whereupon the Suprema, with the exception of Mendoza, voted to suspend the case, which was equivalent to acquittal. Then, on July 8th, Mendoza signed an order of arrest and sent it around for the signatures of the members, who unanimously refused, whereupon he summoned them to his room and with alternate wrath and entreaty vainly sought their cooperation. In a gust of passion he declared that he would have his way, and in an hour he had ordered 3 of them to keep their houses as prisons, and the Madrid tribunal to prosecute the secretary for refusing to countersign the warrant. Foch de Cardona was the only member left, and this was because his half-brother Antonio, now Archbishop of Valencia, was a favorite of the Queen. This violence caused no little excitement, which was increased when Miguelez, one of the members, who talked freely, was arrested one night in August and hurried off to the Jesuit college in Compostela, followed by the jubilating, or retiring on half pay, of all 3 in terms of reprobation, as unfaithful to their duties, while the secretary was banished. The Council of Castile intervened with a consulta pointing out to the king that the members had been punished without trial for upholding the laws, the canons, and the practice of the Holy Office. The Queen became alarmed and urged Mendoza to be cautious, but he assured her that in no other way could her wishes be gratified. Meanwhile, he had sent the papers to the Tribunal of Murcia with orders to prosecute Froilan and send the sentence to him. It obeyed and twice submitted the case to its calificadores and other learned men, who reported in favor of the accused, whereupon it voted for his discharge. Then Mendoza evoked the case to himself, and committed it to the Madrid tribunal. He brought Froilan there and confined him in a cell of the Dominican house of Nuestra Senora de Otocha, where, in the power of Torres Padmota, he lay for 4 years, cut off from all communication with the outside world, his very existence being in doubt, while the tribunal selected another group of calificadores who had no difficulty in finding him suspect of heresy. Carlos had died November 1st, 1700, appointing in his will Philip of Anjou as his successor, until whose coming the Queen Dowager was regent. For some months the members of the Suprema, jubilated by Mendoza's arbitrary assumption of authority, were kept in reclusion, but were finally liberated. Mendoza, who belonged to the Austrian faction, was relegated to his see of Segovia, but this brought no redress to Froilan. The Dominican general, Antonin Cloche, a Frenchman without bias to either party in the Inquisition, felt keenly the injustice committed against him, and sent from Rome successively 2 agents who for 3 years labored in vain for his release. Mendoza was at bay, and, in defiance of the traditions of the Spanish Inquisition, he appealed to the Pope, to whom he sent an abstract of the proceedings. Clement XI was delighted with this surrender of Spanish independence, and referred the case to the Congregation of the Inquisition, which, after much deliberation, reported that it could not act without seeing all the papers. Mendoza replied that he was in exile through political reasons and could not furnish them, which was false, as he had carried them with him. He sent an agent with an argument drawn up by the new fiscal of the Suprema, Juan Fernando de Frias, at the instance of the nuncio at Madrid, in which the Suprema was denounced as the canonizer of a doctrine, heretical, erroneous, superstitious, and leading to idolatry. The paper had been prepared in answer to one by Foix de Cardona, arguing that the members of the Suprema had not merely a consultative but a decisive vote, and that the Inquisitor-General had no more. Frias, however, had foolishly devoted himself to proving that the interrogations of the demoniacs were heretical. This did not suit the nuncio, who openly declared that, in place of refuting Cardona, he had published 1,000 scandals and was a fool of no account. The argument, which he had printed, was condemned and suppressed, and he himself was suspended from office in 1702 by the Queen, Marie Louise Gabrielle of Savoy, who was regent during the absence of Philip in Naples. It was probably about this time that the Suprema notified the tribunals that any orders from Mendoza, contrary to its own, were suspended. The intervention of the nuncio shows that the struggle had widened far beyond the theological question as to the lawfulness of interrogating demons and the guilt of the luckless Froilan Diaz. Two important principles had become involved: the appellate jurisdiction of Rome, and its original jurisdiction in determining disputed points in the internal organization of the Spanish Inquisition. Pope Clement had eagerly welcomed the opening afforded by Mendoza, not only to claim that Froilan's case should be submitted to him, but he had also assumed, in Mendoza's favor, that the Suprema was subordinate to the Inquisitor-General, through whom its powers were derived from the Holy See, which alone could decide the question. All this was vigorously combated by Cardona, with the aid of the Council of Castile. In the name of the Suprema, which now had 3 new members, he rehearsed all of Ferdinand's decrees against appeals, and argued that the Suprema had always been a royal council, subjected to the king, and that the only distinction between its members and the Inquisitor-General lay in his prerogatives as to appointments. He earnestly supplicated the king to order the seizure of a letter of Cardinal Paolucci, papal secretary of state, committing Froilan's case to Mendoza or to the Archbishop of Seville. The nuncio, on the other hand, insisted that the papacy had never divested itself of its supreme authority to judge everything throughout the world, and that the pope was the only authority entitled to construe papal grants, including the functions of the Suprema. While the controversy thus raged, Froilan lay forgotten in his dungeon. Practically, the decision lay with the king, and, in the vicissitudes of the War of Succession, Philip had more pressing matters to vex his new and untried royalty. He seems to have vacillated, for, in July 1703, there was circulated a paper purporting to confirm the jubilation of the members of the Suprema, and to commit Froilan's case to Mendoza. This drew from the Suprema 2 energetic consultas, pointing out Mendoza's arbitrary course and the injury to the regalias of his appeal to Rome. Philip was embarrassed, and, by a royal order of December 24th, sought advice of the Council of Castile, which responded January 8th and 29th, 1704, by vigorous consultas denouncing Mendoza's actions as inexcusable violence. The case seemed to be drawing to a conclusion when it was delayed by a new complication. The succession to Mendoza was actively sought by 2 churchmen of the highest rank, but the king declared that he would not appoint anyone of such lofty station, when both withdrew, and one of them, or someone in his name, started what Cardona calls the diabolical proposition that the Inquisition had become superfluous. The few Judaizers and heretics remaining could be dealt with by the episcopal jurisdiction. The case of Froilan Diaz could be settled by his bishop, and thus the enormous expense of the Holy Office could be saved. This revolutionary suggestion was warmly supported by the Princesse d'Arson, but Philip rejected it. Wisely, no doubt, for even had he been inclined to it, his throne was as yet too insecure to risk the results of such an innovation. The Admiral of Castile was a refugee in Portugal, whence he was actively fomenting resistance to Philip. Mendoza notoriously belonged to the Austrian party, and Philip could ultimately scarce fail to decide against him. On October 27th he sent for Cardona, with whom he had a secret interview, resulting in a paper drawn up for his signature the next day. On November 3rd a royal order was read in the Suprema restoring to their places the 3 jubilado members, who were to receive all the arrears of their salaries. This was followed November 7th by a decree addressed to Mendoza, ordering him and his successors to respect the members of the Suprema as representing the royal person, as exercising the royal jurisdiction, and as entitled to cast decisive votes. Moreover, he was, under pain of exile and deprivation of temporalities, within 72 hours, to deliver to the Suprema all the papers concerning Froilan Diaz, and to make known whether he was alive and in what prison. The next day it was ordered that the Suprema should decide the case, and on November 17th, after hearing the proceedings, a sentence was unanimously rendered, absolving Froilan, restoring to him his seat in the Suprema, with all arrears of salary, and also the cell in the Convent del Rosario assigned to the royal confessors, of which he had been unjustly deprived. A copy of this sentence was ordered to be transmitted to all the tribunals for preservation in their archives. Froilan Diaz was duly reinstated in the Suprema, and we find his signatures to its letters at least until 1712. In reward of his sufferings, Philip nominated him to the See of Avila. He was not, however, a persona grata in Rome, and Pope Clement refused his confirmation on the ground that he must first see the papers in the case and determine whether the acquittal was justified, thus asserting to the last his jurisdiction over the matter. Philip held good and would make no other nomination until after Froilan's death, the see remaining vacant from 1705 until it was filled by Julian Cano y Tovar in 1714. As for Mendoza, he was obliged to resign the Inquisitor-Generalship early in 1705. When, in 1706, Philip returned to Madrid, after his flight to Burgos, Mendoza and the admiral, with many others, were arrested as traitors, and the Queen Dowager was escorted to Bayonne. Mendoza, of course, missed the coveted cardinalate, but he survived until 1727 in peaceful possession of his see. In replacing him as Inquisitor-General, Philip was true to his maxim not to appoint a man of high rank, and he nominated Vidal Marin, bishop of the insignificant see of Sueda, who had distinguished himself in 1704 by his gallant defense of that place against the English fleet that had just captured Gibraltar. In confirming him, after some delay, Clement took occasion, in a brief of August 8, 1705, to reassert the papal position and urgently to exhort him to maintain the subordination of the Suprema. He is to remember that he is supreme, and in him resides the whole grant of apostolic power, while the members of the council derive their power from him. Over them he has sole and arbitrary discretion by deputation from the Holy See, and the consultas of the royal council have caused great scandal and spiritual damage to souls by seeking with fallacious and deceitful arguments to prove that he, after receiving his deputation, is independent of the Holy See. If he will examine his commission, he will see that his powers are derived from the Vicar of Christ, and not from the secular authorities, who have no rights in the premises, and whatever is done contrary to the rights of the Holy See is invalid, and is hereby declared to be null and void. This was doubtless consoling as an enunciation of papal claims and wishes, but the Bourbon conception of the royal prerogative was even more decided than that of the Habsburgs. The exhortation to reassert the supremacy of the Inquisitor-Generalship fell upon deaf ears, and the rule in the Suprema continued to be what Foch de Cardona described in 1703, that the majority ruled. If there was a tie, the matter was laid aside until some absent member attended, while, if the meeting was a full one, the fiscal was called in to cast the deciding vote. In its relations with the tribunals, the Suprema had even greater success. As it gradually absorbed the Inquisitor-General, it exercised his power, which was virtually unlimited and irresponsible, over them, until it became a centralized oligarchy of the most absolute kind. To this, of course, the progressive improvement in communication largely contributed. In the earlier period, the delays and expenses of special messengers and couriers rendered it necessary for the local tribunals to be virtually independent in the routine business of arresting, trying, sentencing, and punishing offenders. Only matters about which there could be dispute, or which involved consequences of importance, would warrant the delay and expense of consulting the central head. Items in the accounts and allusions in the correspondence show that, when this was necessary, the outlay for a messenger was a subject to be carefully weighed. The matter was complicated by the fact that the central head was perambulating, moving with the court from one province to another, and its precise seat at any one moment might be unknown to those at a distance. The permanent choice of Madrid as a capital by Philip II, broken by a short transfer to Valladolid, was favorable to centralization, and still more so was the development of the post office, establishing regular communication at a comparatively trivial cost, although at first the Inquisition was somewhat chary about confiding its secret documents to the postman. At first there was hesitation in intruding upon the functions of the tribunals. A letter of November 10, 1493, from the Suprema to the Inquisitors of Toledo, asks as a favor for the information on which a certain arrest had been made, explaining that this was at the especial request of the Queen. Where there was not unanimity, however, a reference to some higher authority was essential, and we have seen that, in 1488, Torquemada ordered that all such cases should be sent to him to be decided in the Suprema, and, in 1507, Ximenes went further and required all cases in which the accused did not confess to be sent to the council. This seems speedily to have become obsolete, but the rule as to discordia was permanent. In 1509 a letter of the Suprema extends it to arrests and all other acts on which votes were taken, when a report with all the opinions was to be forwarded for its decision. The costs attendant on these references were not small, for we happened to meet with an order, May 23, 1501, to pay to Inquisitor Mercado 100 ducats for his expenses and sickness while at court examining the cases brought from his tribunal of Valencia. Possibly for this reason references to the Suprema were not encouraged, for, about this time, it ordered that none should be brought to it except those in which there was discordia, and in these it expected that the parties should be represented by counsel. The same motive may have led to an order, in 1528, limiting these references to cases of great importance, but this restriction was removed in another of July 11, 1532, when it was explained that, if an inquisitor dissented from the other two and from the ordinary, the case must be sent up. Practically, the authority of the Suprema over the tribunals was limited only by its discretion, and inevitably it was making constant encroachments on their independence of action. Its correspondence in 1539 and 1540 with the Valencia tribunal shows an increasing number of cases submitted to it and its supervision over minute details of current business. In 1543, the case of a Morisca named Mari Gomez La Cezeda shows that a sentence of torture had to be submitted to it, and its reply indicates conscientious scrutiny of the records, for it ordered the re-examination of certain witnesses, but if they were absent or dead, then she might be tortured moderately. A further extension of authority is seen during a witch craze in Catalonia, when, to restrain the cruelty of the Barcelona tribunal in 1537, all cases of witchcraft, after being voted on, were ordered to be submitted to it for a final decision, and, in a recrudescence of the epidemic between 1545 and 1550, it required all sentences of relaxation to be sent to it, even when unanimous. On this last occasion, however, the Barcelona tribunal asserted its independence of action by disregarding the command and a phrase in the instructions of 1561 requiring, in all cases of special importance, the sentences to be submitted before execution, was too vague to be of much practical effect. The supervision which the Suprema was thus gradually developing was most salutary as a check upon the irresponsibility of the tribunals, whose acts were shrouded in impenetrable secrecy except when scrutinized with more or less conscientious investigation by visitors at intervals of 5 or 10 years. The conditions in Barcelona, as revealed by successive visitations between 1540 and 1580, show how a tribunal might violate systematically the instructions, and how fruitless were the exposures made by visitors when the inquisitors chose to disregard the orders elicited by reports of their misdoings. They were virtually a law unto themselves, no one dared to complain of them, and the victims' mouths were closed by the oath of secrecy, which bound them under severe penalties not to divulge their experiences. The whole system was so devised as to expose the inquisitor to the maximum of temptation with the minimum risk of detection, and it was the merest chance whether this power was exercised by a lucero or by a conscientious judge. The consulta de fe and the occurrence of the ordinary furnished but a feeble barrier, for the record could generally be so presented as to produce the desired impression, and the consultors, proud of their position and its immunities, were indisposed to give trouble, especially as their adverse votes did not create a discordia. When Salazar, in 1566, took the unusual trouble of investigating the interminable records of the individual trials, the rebuke of the Suprema to the inquisitors of Barcelona speaks of the numbers of those sentenced to relaxation, reconciliation, the galleys, scourging, etc., after the grossest informalities in the conduct of the trials. The world can never know the cruelties perpetrated under a system which relieved the tribunals from accountability, and consequently any supervision was a benefit, even that imperfectly exercised by the distant Suprema. There seems to have come a dawning consciousness of this, possibly stimulated by the revelations of Salazar's investigations into the 3 tribunals of the Crown of Aragon, which led to the Concordia of 1568. In the same year, a Carta Acordada of June 22 ordered that even when sentences of relaxation were voted unanimously, the process should be sent to the Suprema for its action. From this time forward its intervention, on one score or another, gradually increased. From the records of the Tribunal of Toledo, between 1575 and 1610, it appears that it intervened in 228 cases out of 1,172, or substantially in 1 out of 5, while in only 82 of these cases, or 1 out of 14, was there discordia, sometimes as to arrest and trial, sometimes as to torture, but mostly as to the final sentence. End of Book 4, Chapter 1, Part 2. Recording by Kathleen Nelson, Austin, Texas, September 2010.